This morning we're going to be in the book of Mark, chapter 6. If you have a Bible, you might want to turn there. I'd like to read to you just a couple of verses to sort of prepare our hearts for the Word and for the Lord's table this morning as we're going to be coming to the table. Again, I'm going to ask that we might stand in honor of God's Word, and let me just read a few verses for you here. Beginning with verse 35. I'll just read a part of our passage. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "That would take 8 months of a man's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Let's bow our heads together. And Father, I pray that you would help us see how the little 5 loaves and the 2 fish that we came to church with this morning, not even enough for a snack, much less for a crowd, is something that you can do miracles with far beyond anything we can possibly ever imagine. Lord, I pray you would help us to see that our lack and our weakness, that our inabilities, that the empty places in our lives are the places that are best for you to fill. And so I pray this would be a time when we learn what it means that with you we always have more than enough. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. You may be seated. Two by two, the disciples trudged back into the village by the lake. Undoubtedly, it was the village of Capernaum, one you read about in the Gospels, where Jesus made his home. Jesus was waiting for them there at the waterfront. Some days before, they had set out on their mission. Jesus had sent them out 2 by 2 to do the same kinds of things he'd been doing, but he had some very strict orders for them. They were allowed to travel with sandals and a staff, but no bread, no beggar's bag, no pocket change, not even a change of clothes. They were setting out, you see, on a new Exodus journey, equipped in the same way as their ancestors the night that the Israelites ate that very first Passover meal that we commemorate in just a few moments. Way back in Exodus chapter 12, verse 11, God was giving these instructions, and we read, "This is how you are to eat it, that meal, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover." And interestingly enough, in Jesus' instructions to his disciples, the 2 things that they were given permission to take with them that are mentioned by Jesus are their sandals and their staff. Because they were like the Israelites going out on a new Exodus, where they would have to depend on God to meet their needs. They were going to be traveling, but they didn't have food and they didn't have money. They didn't have all of the things that we make sure we pack before we make a trip. They were going to be announcing God's kingdom, and God was going to be there to meet their needs for them. We read in verses 12 and 13 of Mark chapter 6 that they went out and preached that people should repent. They drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. They did the same things Jesus was doing. They were bringing God's kingdom. And by asking people to repent, what that means is that they were saying to people who were in exile, join us on this Exodus journey. We have found where God is, and we found where his kingdom is. Come join us on the journey to that place. So now as they came back into town, they were ready to report what God had done through them. And we read in verse 30, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. Now, there would have been a line of fishing boats resting on the beach or tied to the docks not far from where they stood. It was a morning. You would have seen the light from the eastern side of the sky shining off the Sea of Galilee. The day would have been fresh. The boats would have all just returned from the night of fishing. Probably the nets were drying and people were cleaning the fish and selling the fish. Some of those boats actually belonged to the very disciples, like Peter and James and Andrew and John. In 1986, just a few miles, literally maybe 1 or 2 miles from, maybe 2 or 3 miles from this exact spot, 2 members of a kibbutz located on the shores of the Sea of Galilee discovered the remains of a boat just like the ones on the beach that day. The lake was abnormally low due to a prolonged drought, and thus large areas of the shore were exposed that had not been exposed for probably hundreds of years. And so these 2 fellows were out after work. They were just snooping around to see if they could find anything interesting out there where normally the lake would have been covering the lake shore, lake bottom. And they came to a place where they saw bits of wood sticking out of the mud. And when they looked at the bits of wood sticking out, they saw that they formed the shape of a boat, of a hull. So they called archaeologists in, and the archaeologists rushed about to dig up this boat. It was in extremely fragile condition. If you know anything about what happens to wood over long periods of time, it basically takes on the character of wet cardboard. And so if you push it or pull at it or whatever, you can just break it apart. And in fact, as the water level began to rise again, the archaeologists had to put sandbags and build a wall, a dam around this boat. They were able to extract it and bring it to shore and eventually restore it, so that if you were to go to the kibbutz Ginosar today, you would see that boat. There it is, actually, in its restored state. It was 27 feet long. It had a shallow hull suited for fishing close to shore. And as you can see in this full reconstruction of it, it had a mast and a sail, or would have originally, had room for 4 people to row, and it actually could carry as many as 15 people. So when we read in Mark chapter 6, verse 31 and 32, that because so many people were coming and going, they did not have a chance to eat, that Jesus said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves into a boat, to a solitary place. It was a boat just like this one. That is why the boat is called the Jesus boat. Colloquially, if you Google Jesus boat, you will come to a website for the Jesus boat, which takes you to the Jewish kibbutz on the shores of the Sea of Galilee in the land of Israel. And actually, there it is to this day, dating from exactly the time of Jesus, and giving us a beautiful picture of how Jesus and his disciples took their journey that day. Now, as they climbed into the boat, every one of them, each of these 12 men, would have had on his shoulder a basket, a wicker basket with a rope handle. It was sort of the size of a backpack. It would have held about 2 gallons worth of stuff, so it wasn't a big sort of bag. In fact, Jewish people all through the Roman Empire carried these kinds of baskets on their shoulders, sort of like a little backpack to hold their belongings. It was such a common thing that you could identify a Jewish person by the fact that they had this particular bag. In fact, one Roman writer refers to the Jewish people by referring to the name of this specific kind of basket that they would have had. And so you can picture these guys getting into the boat with their 12 baskets, each one for their own personal belongings, just as you or I would have a backpack, perhaps, if we were traveling about. Mark tells us that Jesus took them to a remote or a desert place. Actually, the original language that in the scripture says a desert place 3 times in the story, because Mark is making a point, and anybody who would have known the Jewish faith would have known how important the word desert was and is to the Jewish people. It was in the desert, not in Egypt, that God revealed himself. It was in the desert, not in Egypt or even in the Promised Land, that God made them into a people. And it was a strange, strange journey that they took, to go away from everything that was powerful, everything that was comfortable, leave their homes, leave the place where they had raised their children, and go out into absolute nothing. If you ever look at pictures of the Sinai desert, it is desert on steroids. It's not just sand and not just dry, but mountains and deep canyons, just a place where you could get lost in a heartbeat and never come out. But the desert was the place where God called his people so that he could remake them and rebirth them. And in fact, it was also a place where God had promised to refresh them, to restore them. In Jeremiah 31, verse 2, just one example, Jeremiah writes, "This is what the Lord says. The people who survive the sword will find favor in the wilderness, in the desert. I will come to give rest to Israel." And I think Mark has this in mind as he tells us how Jesus said to his disciples, let's go to a desert place where there aren't people and there aren't crowds and there aren't all the demands of daily life. And I'm going to give you rest. I'm going to refresh you. I'm going to restore you. Just like the Lord had promised to Jeremiah, Jesus was now coming as the Lord who would meet his people in the desert and give rest to Israel. Turns out, however, that there were a whole lot more people who wanted to join him there than just the 12 disciples. We read in the next verses, Mark 6:33 to 34, "But many who saw him leaving recognized him and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of him. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so he began teaching them many things." Can you see the scene? They would have been going up the coast, not very far, really, just a couple of miles from where we understand that they would have gone to the north end of the lake. And people would have been running along the shore, watching the boat as the men were rowing along, and the word was kind of going ahead of them, and people were gathering. So by the time the boat lands, literally thousands of people have crowded into this supposedly desert place, hoping that God would at long last set them free as well. They understood the desert, a place like they were going to, was precisely where he had formed Israel into a nation. Wasn't it in a desert place that he had powerfully revealed himself to them and formed a covenant with them? And now, could it possibly be he was about to do it again? That he would once and for all rescue his people? At the time of Jesus, periodically, an individual would rise up and say, "I'm the new Messiah, I'm the king that God has sent." And in every case, that person would go out to a desert place. And then the crowds would come and people would join up. They would even form perhaps an army and then try to bring about the great rescue of Israel from the Romans. And probably many of the people who went out that day were hoping that that's what Jesus would become. We know from John's telling of this story that they tried to make him king that day because they were hoping that God was creating that new kingdom around a renewed Israel. So there's Jesus, here are his disciples, and now all of a sudden they have literally thousands of people joining them for dinner. Deserts may be good places for getting away from it all and regrouping, but they aren't very good when it comes to finding enough food for a massive crowd of people. How many, Dave, for ice cream? 5, lots, right? Yeah. And just as Moses would have felt overwhelmed to have hundreds of thousands of hungry Israelites clamoring for food, the disciples were feeling the same thing. Back in the Exodus story in Numbers chapter 11, Moses complains to God about having to try to come up with food for all of these people in the middle of the desert. And we just read in the middle of his complaint to God, verse 13, he says, "Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep wailing to me, 'Give me meat to eat.'" He goes on to basically ask God to kill him right then and there so he won't have to put up with all of the complaining. And I wonder if the disciples were somewhat afraid the same thing was going to happen. Listen to their response in Mark 6:35 to 36. "By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. This is a, literally, desert place." Third time that term is used. Remote place is part of it, but the literal words are desert place. "This is a desert place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." The desert is no longer a place of rest now for these guys. It's a place of need. It's a place that reminds you of what you aren't and what you can never do, what you don't have. It's a place that strips you down to the bare essentials of existing and leaves you wanting. Anybody knows that a walk in the wilderness is lots of fun when you start out with a full pack, on a nice day. But just read the stories of people who get off the trail or who get caught in bad weather or maybe twist an ankle or whatever, and all of a sudden they find they're going to be there overnight, and maybe it's going to be a couple of days. And I know we've heard even over the past spring of rescues out in the western part of the country, people stuck out there for days, even weeks, trying to survive. The desert can turn on you. The wilderness can turn on you so quickly. And that was the experience of these disciples. They had gone looking for a chance to get away from it all and just relax and be refreshed and be restored by being with Jesus after all their hard work. Now, however, with lots of people crowding in, it's getting dark. There are no stores. There are no vendors. People are hungry. Children are crying. It's way past dinner time. The disciples can see that this could get ugly in a hurry. And so they say, I think we ought to dismiss the meeting. Send them all home. Let them figure it out. It's a desert place. At this point, the story takes that unexpected turn. If you had never read it before, verse 37, but he answered, you give them something to eat. And Jesus' answer only intensifies the terror of the desert. You feed them. How? With what? I mean, just think how exposed you would feel if you were one of the disciples. You've come to Jesus with a legitimate problem, with a legitimate question, out of compassion for these poor, hungry people, knowing that we don't have anything for them. They need to go get some food. Let's call the meeting off so they have time before it gets dark. And Jesus turns the tables on you and says, you fix it. Me fix it. Look at what they say in verse 37b. Boy, that would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? Point being, we can't, we couldn't, we wouldn't. The words literally drip with sarcasm. This isn't going to happen. Even Jesus, it turns out, needs a reality check once in a while. We've got to straighten this guy out. I mean, after all, what does he think is going to happen here? I mean, it's all fine to talk about the kingdom of God, and it's all fine to imagine a beautiful future, but this is reality. It's now, probably 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night. Is getting dark. This is long before the days of flashlights. People are hungry. We don't have anything for them. But Jesus sends them back to those baskets. Remember the ones they put in the boat? The ones where everybody had their stuff for the day, their lunch, maybe a few personal belongings. So they go back and they find their baskets, and we read in Mark 6:36, he says, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And so they rummage around, and John tells us they had a little help from a little kid with a lunch, and they come back and they say, well, we got 5 loaves and 2 fish. I don't know how much food they started the day with. I would hope that Mrs. Peter packed Peter's basket with lots of good stuff. Hadn't seen him for a few weeks and figured he'd probably be hungry. And I'm sure every one of them had some food as they traveled across the lake and were snacking along, and maybe they'd had a little bit of a lunch. But by evening, they were collectively, all 12 guys, count Jesus, all 13 of them, down to 5 little barley cakes and 2 little fish. Proof positive that they weren't going to be feeding anybody that evening. You can just see them coming back to Jesus going, see, we told you so. I mean, we told you we didn't have enough. Look, we're down to nothing. Thomas ate all of it, or whoever. It's all so familiar to us what happened next. Like the Good Shepherd in David's Psalm 23, Mark tells us that he has them lie down in the green grass. Remember how Psalm 23 begins? He makes me lie down in green pasture. Well, Mark tells us he had them lie down in the green grass. He had them divided up into companies of hundreds and 50s so that this vast crowd was all in little blocks, just as Moses had divided up Israel when they were out in the desert by hundreds and by 50s so that they could function as a unit. Again, they're on an Exodus journey, and Jesus is treating them like that. Then Jesus takes the scraps of food, these little 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He tells us he takes the bread and he holds them up to heaven and blesses them. He undoubtedly prayed the familiar Jewish prayer, the dinner prayer, that goes like this: Blessed art thou, O Lord, our King, King of the world, who brings forth bread from the earth. And then he breaks the loaves, just as a Jewish father would do at dinner, and then would pass the bread out to the rest of the family. Dinner is served. And we read in verse 41, then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. How do you divide 2 fish among them all? Well, Mark lets us sort of fill that in our own minds. He divided those 2 little fish among them all. See, Mark is telling us that God did for his people there on that day what he had done for Israel when they found themselves without food in the desert. Remember those baskets that the disciples had carried on their shoulders? Remember how empty those baskets were? If you ran through all 12 of the baskets, they could only come up with 5 little loaves and 2 fish. What a different story when Jesus was finished feeding the crowd. Verses 42 and 44, we read, they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 baskets full of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. Matthew goes on to tell us that the women and children were there too, so the number just simply increases by probably another 10,000. That term basket is where we find the word for that special wicker basket with the rope that you could put over your shoulder like a backpack that every Jewish man would have. Now each disciple goes back to the boat with his personal basket brimming with pieces of bread and fish. That's what was going on with those baskets. Each morsel, notice, had been pulled from the loaves and broken from the fish by the fingers of the Lord who gives rest in the desert. Every piece that you pulled out was a broken piece. The only person that could break them and still have more in his hand was Jesus. So every little piece, every bit of provision that was in every one of those full baskets had been broken and divided by the Lord. And that raises a question for you and me. How much is enough? Ask a millionaire how much is enough, and what's he or she going to say? 1 more million? And you and I could probably think of $1 million and go, oh, $1 million. What could you? Yeah, but once you get the first million, then what? You done? What about that guy over there that's got 2 or 3 of them? Remember that president's wife in the Philippines? Yeah. How many shoes is enough? I know there's not a woman in this church that would say that she needed 1 more pair of shoes. I understand that. Okay, guys, how many tools are enough? I won't ask that question either. How much is enough when you're in a desert? Enough for 1 more meal? Is that enough? Then where will the next meal come from? What's enough? You see, those disciples had enough. They could divide it up. 5 loaves, 2 fish. Do the math. Everybody gets a little mouthful. But then what? Now, how much is enough when you're in a desert place with Jesus? Is the tiny bit you have enough? Only if you give it to Him. Only if you give it to Him. He knows how much you have. He's not afraid to ask you to bring it before Him. It will always look paltry in the face of the needs that you face. Whether you're there with your family and you run out of patience. I need more patience. What's the Lord do? He doesn't send down a bucket full of patience. I've never noticed that. But he may say to you, how much do you have right now? Not enough. How much? 2 minutes. Give it to me. He starts with what we have. He starts with where we are. You can find these stories all through the Bible. This isn't the only one. The prophet Elijah, hungry, meets a starving widow. She's cooking the last meal for her son and her daughter, for her son and herself. This is it. 2 little pancakes or tortillas or whatever, and then they're going to just die. There's no food in the entire town. There's no food in the entire area. The prophet says, make me one first. Oh, isn't that selfish? But you see, that was his way of saying, take the little bit you have and give it to a God you don't even know yet. And we read that throughout the rest of that famine, the oil never ran out, the flour never ran out. How much is enough? The last thing you and I will do when we're down to the very end is part with that last little bit. That's our security. That's what we're holding on to. And that's understandable. But what if Jesus is there, and what if he can do something brand new? How much is enough when Jesus is there with you? Your tiny bit is enough, but only if you give it to him. This morning, in just a second, we'll be partaking of the Lord's Supper. The bread broken and the cup. It's a picture of Jesus giving what he had. One life, despised and rejected, cast aside. His death considered already a footnote, even at the time that he died. Certainly no one would remember that moment 5 years, 10 years later. Jesus was willing to give the little bit that he had for the whole wide world, billions of people. He was willing to go into a desert place, an ugly hill called the Skull, and let himself become the bread that was broken. But it was enough. It was enough for you and enough for me and enough for this whole wide world. Because when God begins that work of recreating, the little bit can become an endless supply. And he wants to do the same thing in your life and in my life. Whatever area in your life right now, you feel the deepest need and the deepest emptiness and the deepest hopelessness, and you have the greatest questions, and you could just see how it could be so good if I just had a little more of this or a little more of that. Just listen, Jesus will be saying, bring me what you have. Just bring me what you have. And watch what I can do through you. But it'll only happen if you'll give it to him. Let's bow our heads together. I'm going to ask that our elders come down, Pastor Rob come down, and we're going to prepare the Lord's table this morning. For you, it's a chance for you to, I hope, put some of these thoughts into action as you receive the bread and cup and take that into your body. Think of it as an exchange whereby you're giving up that little bit to him so that he can multiply what he wants to do through you. Whether it be in a relationship, or be with your children, be with your family, be in your work situation, whether it be just daring to trust him in some area where you know you can't make things go forward. Some of us just even need to realize that even what we have and who we are and how things are going might be pretty good at this moment, but even that is just a tiny piece of what God could do if we would let him be in charge. So this is our chance to say, Lord, only with you do I discover more than enough.